Hello, today we're going to focus on the character of Mrs Birling, a woman who, for my money, is the most villainous character in J.B. Priestley's spellbinding 1945 thriller, An Inspector Calls. Now, back in the 1930s, Priestley wrote a book called An English Journey, and in it he describes capitalism as the real villain, and he says we need to tame it. Now, given that Mrs Birling is a embodiment, a representative, a cipher of capitalism, she too can be seen as the real villain. And if she needs taming, well, perhaps that's a job for Inspector Gould. An easy win if you're looking for a line that telegraphs Mrs Birling's toxic prejudices towards the working class is that line of hers, "Girls of that class." Because in those four little words, we see very clearly the contempt she has for what she sees as an inferior social strata, the proletariat or the working class. And it's these prejudices that compel her to treat Eva Smith so heartlessly. And let's not forget, Mrs Birling denied Eva charity when she needed it most. This girl was half-starved, desperate, pregnant, and Mrs Birling wouldn't condescend to throw a few pennies her way. So you could argue that she gives Eva that last push towards that bottle of bleach. The stage directions that kick off Act 1 give us a clear indication of the kind of character Mrs Birling is. It says that she's in her 50s and she's a cold woman and her husband's social superior. And it's that coldness that doesn't just inhibit Mrs Birling from giving any crumbs of charity to Eva. That coldness also means that she feels no responsibility. She cannot be made to feel guilty for the horrific suicide of this girl, which arguably she had a significant role in causing. To give you a wee bit of background on Mrs Birling, she'd have been born in the Victorian era, when Queen Victoria was on the throne. And during this time, the British upper class would have been really encouraged not to show emotion, to maintain what's known as a stiff upper lip. And so, to mask or bottle up their feelings, they'd have been encouraged to present a kind of mask of politeness, and that would conceal how they truly felt. Now, in Mrs Birling's case, that polite mask just about conceals her heartless, sometimes spiteful nature. This callous or heartless nature, of course, manifests itself in her lack of concern for the plight of the poor. And it's interesting to think that in some ways it's maybe necessary for Mrs Birling to demonise, to denigrate, to criticise the poor. Because if she does that, then she doesn't have to feel any guilt or responsibility about what capitalist exploitation, about what her husband's factory does to the poor. She can just sit back and enjoy the profits. So degrading them stops her from worrying about how she makes her money. And imagine what might happen if for 1 second she started thinking about these people, the working class, as real human beings with hopes and feelings. Do you know what? She might then feel a need to help them, to distribute some of her wealth more fairly. And of course, that's going to affect her quality of life. That's going to be less cash in the bank for Mrs Birling. So that's why she vigorously resists seeing these people as human beings. And it would have been a common perception or misconception during the Edwardian era for many rich people to see the poor as bringing poverty on themselves. These rich people would have said, well, they've got no morals, this working class. All they're interested in is drink and sex. They're no better than animals, glut in their base instincts. So there was this idea then, propagated by the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, that somehow the poor deserved to be poor because they didn't help themselves. They were too busy hitting the pub or the bedroom to put a few bob aside. And one of the things that Priestley suggests in this play is that if you like the Birlings and you see the poor in that way, that conveniently conceals the true causes of poverty. To Priestley, that's capitalist exploitation. The rich take all the profits and paying the poor crummy wages. So lines like "girls of that class" What that says really is, I'm not the problem, not me, Mrs Birling, you're the problem, the poor. Girls of that class means poverty is caused by the poor, not poverty is caused by the rich. It's significant when we're first introduced to Mrs Birling that she's not drinking port, even though it's a celebration. Why is she not drinking port? Well, this is a woman, this is a character that's preoccupied, obsessed with following social codes or rules of etiquette. Good manners, if you will. And good manners of the time, of the Edwardian era, would have dictated women don't drink spirits. Respectable women, at any rate. And in fact, she also goes on to criticise her husband, Mr Birling, for wanting to praise the cook. She says, Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things. And this gives us a really good insight into Mrs Birling's key flaw, because she's so obsessed with manners, with putting on that civilised, respectable front, that she doesn't really concern herself with morality. She doesn't really concern herself with the rights and wrongs of how we treat other people. In short then, she will always put manners before morality. You know, she'll always be more concerned about whether you're using the proper knife to eat fish than whether how you treat a young girl might actually lead to her suicide. Another major flaw of Mrs Birling is the way that she treats her grown-up children as if they were still children. She infantilises them. That's the A-star word we want to use. She infantilises them, treats them like children. She says of Eric at one point, he's just a boy. She's very surprised that he drinks. And with Sheila, she refers to her as a child, and very patronisingly says at one point that she must be overexcited. Now bear in mind, these are young adults, they're in their 20s. But because they've been infantilised by their mother, in a way they haven't really matured, they haven't really learned to control their emotions. Like children, they lash out. Of course, this is real danger to the working class, as embodied by Eva. Sheila's little temper tantrum, when she's consumed with jealousy, leads her to lash out, and she petulantly gets Eva sacked. Eric gets drunk, and he rapes Eva. He has an urge to have sex, and he doesn't care who gets hurt, who gets in the way. He's going to satisfy that urge. He's got a lack of concern for the consequences. He doesn't consider other people. And I think we can kind of lay the blame for that petulance squarely on Mummy's doorstep. Now, you've probably worked out by now that I'm not Mrs Birling's biggest fan. You're never going to see me waggling the pom-poms, giving it, give me an M, M, R, R, S, S, B, B, I, I. None of that. Never going to happen. But if we can say something original and controversial about this character, that's really going to mark us out as an A-star prospect, so long as what we're saying is well supported by evidence and well explained. And what I'm going to go on to say here is something that presents Mrs Birling in a slightly more sympathetic light than the examiner will be used to reading about. Now, this is the quotation that we're going to explore with a view to securing that A-star. This is when she says, "Now, Arthur, if you've no more to say, I think Sheila and I had better go into the drawing room and leave you men." And she says this in Act 1 at the end of the dinner party. And you might look at that quote and think, well, so what? She's leaving the room. Why am I supposed to feel sorry for her? Why am I supposed to whip out my hanky? Well, shut up for a second and let me explain. See, what she's doing in those lines of dialogue is she's following social convention. She's abiding by those rules that govern good manners. She's leaving the men to serious business talk. And why that saddens me a little bit is because she seems to be almost like complicit in her own lowly position in the gender hierarchy. I mean, you look at Eva, who fights for her rights. Sheila, who says, she's not prepared to settle for being second best over her husband's work commitments. Here we see this is a woman that's kind of happily accepted her low position in society. She's like a happy slave. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you a model paragraph where we turn those ideas into the kind of sweet, sweet A-star goodness the examiner loves so much. And there it is, drinking that beauty. I'm going to read it through and then just explain very briefly why it is so good. Although it defies conventional readings, it is possible to perceive Mrs Birling as a figure worthy of our pity. In Act 1 she says to her husband, "I think Sheila and I better go into the drawing room and leave you men." This shows how she blindly follows the rules of good etiquette, which forces her into an inferior position in the gender hierarchy. In a sense, she's complicit in her own subjugation, accepting the cultural assumption that women cannot or should not follow the business talk of men. And you'll notice the way I've kicked off this paragraph, although it defies conventional readings. As soon as the examiner sees that, he knows I'm offering up an interesting and alternative interpretation for this character. And if I pull that off well, he's going to be very impressed. I've also used some high-level vocabulary. Good etiquette, just sounds a little bit better than manners, doesn't it? And this is a winner. She is complicit in her own subjugation rather than she helps put herself in a lower social position. Notice I am using high-level Lexis vocabulary, but I'm using it accurately. If you do think, do you know what, I'm not confident using those kind of words, my advice would be maybe don't use them then, because if you apply them in the wrong context, it's going to sound a little bit clunky what you're writing. And let's face it, you're still going to score very highly in this exam if you're presenting sophisticated ideas like this, but in simple language. So, to conclude this first video on Mrs Birling, because there will be a sequel, she doesn't care about the plight of the poor. She's emotionally cold, she's heartless. Also, she holds these nasty prejudices towards the working class, basically blames them for their own poverty, conveniently overlooking the influence of capitalism on the lives of the poor. She prioritises manners over morals, infantilises her children, which turns them into unpleasant individuals. But we can feel a germ, a hint, a scintilla, a grain of pity for this woman, because she has been conditioned by society to accept a woman's low status in that society. And that's your lot. Time, gentlemen, please. Mrs Birling, a bit of a villain.